All right, so today we're going over how do we review for the final exam long essay question or LEQ. So the first thing I want to actually show you is what exactly is the question. So the historical skill you should already be aware of is periodization. And the question is, analyze the social and economic ways the new contacts among Western Europe, Africa, and the Americas from 1450 to 1750 represent a turning point in world history. Now, let me just give you one tip. The essay question you're going to be getting on Tuesday is going to say 1492, but I decided to push it back a little bit to 1450. It's really not that big of a deal. I just figured not to emphasize so much of Columbus. So just be aware that you will see a different date when you get the essay question on the day of the test. You could do it going back to 1450. So we're talking here, we're focusing on social and economic. So that's how we have to phrase this essay in the terms of social and economic. So if we start talking about political, it doesn't fit for the question. If we start talking about cultural, it doesn't fit for the question. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go over with you guys what are some of the key economic characteristics, what are some of the key social characteristics, and then you can decide, is this a turning point or not, and if it is, how, and I'll go over some of the key points on the rubric and some of the things you have to remember when writing a periodization LEQ. So, as far as economic, this time period really marks the beginning of globalization and a beginning of a truly globalized economy. And a part of that is because the colonization of the Americas and the Europeans beginning to control those areas and the economic advantages that gave to them. So when you're writing about the colonization of the Americas in your essay, you don't want to focus on the political organization or how those colonies were ruled. You want to be focusing on the economic impacts of those colonies. That's an important distinction to keep in the back of your head. Also, the Atlantic slave trade beginning during this time period, the global silver trade, which we talked quite a bit about in class. The triangular trade. The triangular trade is the trade that is going to develop between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So, for instance, slaves would go from Africa to the Caribbean, and then sugar would go to Europe, and then manufactured goods would go to Africa in order to be able to buy the slaves, making a big triangle around the Atlantic Ocean. This also goes into the idea of mercantilism. So mercantilism is an important economic event that happens, or economic theory that comes out of this age of globalization, kind of linked to the colonization of the Americas. So remember, in regards to mercantilism, it doesn't have to be linked to colonies, because the theory behind mercantilism is a country wants to have wealth stored up. They want to have wealth in their, basically in their bank account. So the ideal trading situation is you want to be exporting or selling more than you're importing or buying. Now, this comes into play with the colonization of the Americas, because colonies kind of makes it possible for the mother country to develop this type of economic situation, because they're getting so much money from the colonies. That's allowing them to build up and store up a surplus of money. And also in the colonial aspect of mercantilism, you should know that the goal of a colony, or the purpose of why a mother country goes to the trouble of having a colony, is that the colony is there for the benefit of the mother country. So the colony provides raw materials, and the mother country is going to take those raw materials, manufacture them, and sell them back to the colonies as manufactured goods. We also see the creation of joint stock companies, like you might remember from talking about this in class, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, and then also the British East India Company. So you could talk about these two things and how this helped to create or encourage trade. So we also see that the colonies that are set up, sugar is one of the major crops. Remember, this goes back to the Southernization article that you guys read, and this idea that they took sugar, which was grown in India, and they brought it into the Caribbean, which was a climate that was beneficial to that, and that allowed them to create to start creating these large sugar plantations and begin growing sugar in the Caribbean, because they couldn't get into the Indian sugar trade. So these were mostly in Brazil and the Caribbean, and sugar was in very, very high demand in Europe. So the colonies were set up almost exclusively for export. These sugar plantations were based on slave labor, because it took a lot of labor to produce sugar, and about 80% of the captured Africans went to these areas. Now in North America, the major colonial powers there are England and France, and they got a later start, and North America, and basically was considered the leftovers. But the cash crops you're going to see being grown on a large scale in North America is going to be tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo. We also see, which goes into social, which goes into social, is that we have these much less racial mixing, and I'll talk about this when I show you the social slide. And we have sharply defined races that are going to develop in North America as opposed to South America. But these were settler colonies, many people coming for religious freedom. Now, one of the major social changes that happened as a result of all of these contacts is the new social classes, the new races that are going to develop as a result of this. So if you remember from class, the Spanish set up something called the encomienda system. And the encomienda system was a way to reward those people who had captured land for the Spanish. So basically, the land, so in thanks for helping them take over, lands in South America, the Spanish king gave a guy a large plot of land. That plot of land was his encomienda. He was allowed to develop that land in any which way he wanted. The people that lived on that land, he was allowed to get forced labor from them. He was actually also allowed to collect taxes from them, and in return they had to give them Christianity. As a result of Spanish colonization, we see new societies and new races begin to develop, like the mestizos and the mulattoes. So the mestizos were the blends of European and Native American races. We see a lot of this in Mexico and Peru, because those were large centers of Native American population. And the mulattoes were blends of Europeans and Africans, and these we're going to find in our slave colonies, so the places where a lot of sugar is being grown. And what the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French were seeking in setting up these colonies, of course I mentioned this in class as well, was what's called the 3 Gs, gold, God, gold, and glory. So one of the reasons why these new races developed is because you can see from this graph, the Native American population is going to sharply decrease. And this all goes back to, in essence, smallpox and the effect of smallpox on the population. But here you can see, and you should have this in your notes already because I had you copy this down in class, we see this new social structure develop where the Spanish put themselves at the top of the system, Spanish-born Spanish. Remember, the Creoles who were American-born Spanish were not regarded as highly within this social system. And then you have the groups of new races that develop, the mestizos and the mulattoes, which are mixtures of all these different races together. And at the bottom of the social scale were the Native Americans and the Africans. So that gives us some basic information to think about what we're going to want to put into this essay. So that kicks us back to this essay. Analyze the social and economic ways the new contexts amongst Western Europe, Africa, and the Americas from 1450 to 1750 represent a turning point in world history. So first thing we're going to look at is the thesis. You need to have a clear thesis that directly answers all parts of the question. And this must do more than just restate the question. You can't just say there were new contacts between the Americas, Africa, and Europe as a result of the Age of Exploration and call it a day. You must decide if you feel that this time period is a turning point. You must include in your essay, in your thesis, the time period and in question and the region. You must also include a justification for why you felt this was a turning point or why you felt it was not a turning point. And remember, you have to think about, was this an economic turning point and was this a social turning point? You have to include both. So, for example, now, you can't use this word for word because I'll recognize it when we're reading your essay. You have to put it into your own words, but you can use this as a model. The new contacts between Western Europe, Africa, and the Americas during 1450 to 1750 reflect an economic and social turning point. Western Europe began to become a dominant economic power, creating colonial empires, joint stock companies, and the concept of mercantilism. As a result of this change, new social classes developed. So what I'm doing here is I'm stating the fact that I think it is a turning point, an economic and a social turning point, and then I'm giving justification. Why do I actually think this is a turning point? Now, you don't have to say it was a turning point. You can say you felt like it was not a turning point. You can also split the two. It was an economic turning point, but it wasn't a social turning point. Or vice versa. It wasn't a social turning point, but it wasn't an economic one, but it was a social turning point. And again, you could also say that it was not a turning point at all. You have to decide. But once you decide, you have to make sure that you are going to then be consistent in the body of your essay. And your essay is going to be thesis driven. And what that means is that you are clearly and consistently stating how the evidence supports this thesis. So any evidence you're giving about the economic changes that are happening, you have to explain why you feel that makes it a turning point or why you feel it does not make it a turning point. So once you've decided what your thesis is, what your thesis statement is going to be, you must prove it. If you say it was a turning point, you cannot later give evidence saying it was not. You do not want to contradict your thesis statement. So you have to give evidence. So support the stated thesis or makes a relevant argument using specific evidence. So since you have to give both economic and social, you might want to think 3 pieces of evidence of how it was or was not an economic turning point and 3 pieces of evidence of how it was or was not a social turning point. Wherever possible, you want to give examples from specific countries or colonies. So you want to talk about the Spanish colonies in specifics. You want to be talking about the North American colonies in specifics, the Caribbean colonies in specifics. You want to give specific pieces of evidence. Look back in your notes. Look in your textbook over the pages you read for subheadings. That's where you're going to get the information from. So you must, because the historical thinking skill for this is periodization, you must describe the ways in which the historical development specified in the prompt was different from or similar to the events that preceded and or followed. So if you're saying that this was a turning point, you have to talk about how this is different from 600 to 1450. Or if you feel this was not a turning point, you have to talk about how you felt this was similar to 600 or 1450. That's going to help to strengthen your argument of what you're trying to say. So you must discuss what it was like in the previous time period. I'm not going to say the next time period because you don't know what the next time period next. Next year, when we have a lot more information under our belt, we do a periodization essay. You could kind of argue either way and say it, really wasn't a difference from 1750 to 1900, but we don't have that information yet. So you're going to be focusing on what was it like economically and socially between 600 to 1450, and does this make this a turning point or what it doesn't. So, your analysis. You need to analyze the extent to which the historical development specified in the prompt was different from and similar to developments that preceded and or followed, providing specific examples to illustrate your analysis. So you don't have to talk about how it's both similar and different. Pretty much, if you're saying it's a turning point, you're going to focus on how it's different. And if you're going to say it's not a turning point, you're going to focus on how it's similar. But you don't have to do both. Okay, so you talk about what happened to make this time period a turning point. So what was going on that actually created this to be a turning point? And of course, finally, you must have synthesis. This is the last body paragraph. You must extend the argument by explaining the connection between the argument and a development in a different historical period, situation, era, or geographical era. So, think about trade in the Indian Ocean, which would be the same time period because the Indian Ocean trade is going on during the 1450 to 1750 time period. Or think about the land-based trade routes, which would be a different time period. So think about Trans-Saharan, think about Silk Road. Those are the things you want to be focusing on for synthesis. Now, I am going to expect you to do an outline for this essay. Mr. McGilligan is going to collect that outline the day that you're writing this essay, which is on Tuesday. So be prepared. If you have any questions, you can email me. If you want me to look over your outline, I would be happy to do so. Just don't email me at like 11 o'clock the night before the essays due because I'm going to be sleeping because I have to wake up the next morning to grade essays. So good luck on your LEQ. Like I said, if you have any questions or you need any help, email me. I promise I will get back to you as long as you email me, at a reasonable hour, not the night before the essay question. But then give me like a couple of hours to get back to you because I'm going to be grading essays all day. But I hope this gives you a good overview of what the essay is going to be like. I hope you have a clear idea of what you want to write. And again, if you have any questions, I am just an email away. I'll see you guys on the 13th.